All right, today we're decoding a really fascinating, super intricate system of prophecy. I mean, this thing pulls together history, some pretty complex numerology, and even signs in the stars, all to predict future events. So let's just dive right in and see how it all supposedly works.
So, right at the heart of this whole thing is a pretty deep question, right? Can you actually find patterns in history, in numbers, and even in the stars that reveal the future? The system we're going to break down today argues, yeah, you absolutely can, and it lays out a very, very specific framework for how it all connects.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we're going to look at 5 key building blocks. First up, there's a prophetic starting point. Then we'll see how it connects to these ancient timelines. After that, we dive into the numerology of 2017 and 2018. Then we'll look up at the signs in the heavens. And finally, we'll put it all together and see how this thing assembles the final prophecy.
All right, let's get into it. Section 1, the prophetic starting point. And this is absolutely crucial because everything, and I mean everything we're about to talk about, hinges on one single moment in modern history.
So what is that moment? Well, it's the establishment of the modern state of Israel, right there between 1947 and 1948. Now, according to this theory, this wasn't just some political event. Nope. It was like a master key turning in a lock, starting up a series of ancient prophetic clocks. It is the absolute foundation. Without it, none of the other math we're going to look at even makes sense.
Okay, so now let's see how this thing builds. The next layer of this theory connects that modern anchor point all the way back to events that happened millennia ago. Seriously, thousands of years in the past.
And yeah, we're talking about a massive leap through time here. The system literally draws a straight line from 537 BCE when the Jews returned from Babylonian exiles all the way to 1947 CE and that UN resolution. So the big question is, how on earth is that connection even made?
Well, here's the math that supposedly bridges that gap. The theory actually uses 2 different calculations, both based on specific readings of ancient texts. So the first one starts in 537 BCE and adds 2,520 years. Now that number comes from 7 prophetic periods of 360 days each, and boom, it lands you exactly in 1947. Then there's a second calculation. This one starts a bit earlier, in 605 BCE, and it uses our standard 365-day years, and it lands right on 1948.
All right, now we're getting into what is maybe the densest part of this whole theory, numerology. This is where we get into the idea that letters, words, even entire years hold these hidden numerical meanings, and the system they use to uncover them is called gematria.
So what exactly is gematria? Well, it's this ancient system where every single letter in an alphabet, think Hebrew or Greek, also has a number attached to it. So what you do is you add up the values of all the letters in a word, and you get this numerical total, and that number is believed to hold some kind of deeper, hidden meaning.
Okay, let's look at a real example of how this is used. Take the Hebrew year 5777, which lines up with our 2017. This year is seen as super significant. Why? Well, the theory points out that its digits, 5777, are a mirror of 7775. And where does that number come from? They say it's derived from dates in the story of Noah's Ark, and they call it the Ark Rest Code, and claim it's a signal for a time of destruction.
And this same idea is applied to really important words. For instance, take a look at the original Greek word for Armageddon. According to this system, that's not just a word for a famous battle. No, it's a code. A code with a hidden number inside.
And that number? It's 1008. The gematria value of Armageddon is 1008. Now you're going to want to keep that number in mind because it's seen as yet another code pointing to a time of major upheaval. But that's not all for 2017. It's also highlighted because of this incredible convergence of major historical anniversaries. I mean, think about it. It marked exactly 70 years from that UN resolution in 1947. It was 50 years, a jubilee period, from the Six-Day War in 1967, and it was even 500 years from a major siege of Jerusalem back in 1517. In a system like this, a pileup like that is seen as, well, no coincidence at all. And the word we're looking at here is, of course, Armageddon. To figure out its value, the source material goes back to the original Greek spelling, just as it appears in the ancient texts.
So when you add up all the Greek letters for Armageddon using this gematria system, the number you get is 1008. Now you're going to want to remember that number. It's the next big piece of this puzzle.
Okay, so let's do the math. The source takes our anchor year, 5778, and adds the gematria value of Armageddon, which we now know is 1008, and that gives us a brand new number, 6786.
So, what in the world is so special about 6786?
Well, this is where the story takes a really unexpected turn. The source claims that this number, 6786, isn't just some random sum. It says it actually appears in a place you would probably never, ever think to look.
Yep, it's found within the infinite, never-ending digits of pi. According to the source, the very first time the sequence 6786 ever appears in pi, it's right there at that exact spot. Pretty wild, right?
So there's our number, 6786, sitting right inside pi. But the theory doesn't stop there. It actually argues that the numbers immediately surrounding it, the 954 right before it and the 707 right after it, are just as important.
These neighboring numbers are presented as the final key we need to unlock this whole thing. Apparently, they hold one last piece of information that ties this entire complicated chain of events together.
And the logic here is actually pretty simple. You take the number that comes right before our sequence, 954, and you add it to the number that comes right after it, 707, and the sum of those two is 1661.
And here it is, the final connection. Remember how 1008 was the Greek gematria for Armageddon? Well, the source claims that this new number, 1661, is the Hebrew gematria value for a very specific biblical prophecy.
And that prophecy is Malachi 4, verse 5. The claim is that if you take this exact verse in its original Hebrew and add up the letter values, the total is precisely 1661, bringing this whole crazy sequence to its conclusion.
So let's just quickly run that all back one more time. You start with the year 5778. You add the Greek value of Armageddon, 1008, which gives you 6786. You find that exact number inside of pi, and then the sum of the numbers right next to it, 1661, is claimed to be the precise Hebrew value of the prophecy in Malachi 4:5.
Okay, so let's shift gears to the very next year in the Hebrew calendar, 5778, which corresponds to our 2018. Now, if you thought 5777 was coded, this one is argued to be one of the most, let's say, supernaturally coded numbers of all.
And this is where the theory just starts pulling connections from all over the place. It's pretty wild. The number 5778 is claimed to be significant in a bunch of completely unrelated fields. For example, it's cited as the surface temperature of the sun in Kelvin. It's also presented as the exact gematria value of a verse from Matthew that says, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand." And, just to top it off, in pure mathematics, it's what's known as the 107th triangle number.
Okay, so we've had history, we've had numerology. Next up, the theory moves from numbers on a page to actual signs in the heavens, and it focuses on one very specific, very major astronomical event that happened right here in the US.
And I'm sure you remember this one. It was the Great American Eclipse back on August 21st, 2017. This was that incredible total solar eclipse that cut a path clear across the entire country. And as you can probably guess, it's interpreted here as another critical piece of this prophetic puzzle. So, the source gets really specific. It focuses on the exact coordinates of the eclipse's point of greatest duration. That's 37.5 degrees north, 88.8 degrees west. Now, for most of us, those are just a couple of numbers on a map. But in this system, nope, they're the input for the next big calculation. And honestly, the calculation itself is surprisingly simple. You just multiply the two coordinate numbers together. So, 37.5 times 88.8 equals exactly 3,330. Just like that, a geographical location on Earth is translated into a brand new prophetic number.
So now, how does this new number connect back to everything else? Well, here's how. The theory takes the biblical year of the very first Passover, which is given as 2448. It then adds that eclipse value we just got, 3330, and what's the sum? It's 5778, the exact same prophetic Hebrew year we were just talking about. It's pretty incredible how the system ties astronomy, geography, and biblical history all into one single thread.
All right, we're at the final step. Let's see how all of these different threads, we're talking historical dates, numerology, celestial signs, how they all get woven together to point towards one specific final year.
Today, we're going to dig into an interpretation that argues those events were actually predicted thousands of years ago. So, was 2020 a year of prophecy? Well, we're going to look at a source that makes a really bold claim, that the global upheaval we all lived through was described in detail, ages ago. Let's unpack how they build this case, piece by piece. All right, so the whole argument kicks off in one of the most, well, mysterious books of the Bible, Revelation, and specifically with this really dramatic passage known as the Sixth Seal. This source we're looking at sees this as the trigger, the thing that sets off a whole chain reaction of prophetic signs. So you've got this verse describing the sun turning black, the moon turning to blood, classic, really intense imagery. But here's the twist. According to the source we're examining, this isn't supposed to be just a single one-off event. Nope, it's the start of a whole pattern. And they even have a name for it, the cosmic signs pattern. And get this, they give it a super modern time frame. The argument is that these signs from Revelation are part of a sequence that's happening right now, and the year 2020, it's sitting smack dab in the middle of it all. Okay, so Revelation gives us the big picture, right? The cosmic heavenly signs. But to really zero in on the details, this interpretation turns to a parallel passage in the Gospel of Luke. This is where they start looking for connections to things happening right here on Earth. In this passage, it adds way more detail. You've got nation shall rise against nation, you've got famines, but it's one word in particular that becomes the absolute linchpin for the whole 2020 argument: pestilences. And this is where it gets really interesting, where the source starts drawing these direct lines. Nation versus nation gets mapped to modern global conflicts. Famines, well, that's linked to worldwide economic collapse. And pestilences, this is the big one, are identified specifically as the COVID-19 pandemic. So, right here, this is the absolute core of the argument. It's not some vague, fuzzy prediction. The source literally pinpoints that ancient word, pestilences, and says, that's it, that's the COVID-19 pandemic. Pretty much everything else they build rests on this very specific connection to the year 2020. So let's recap. We've got the big cosmic signs, and we've got a specific event. The third and final piece of this puzzle comes from the book of Daniel. And this is where it gets mathematical, because the source claims it contains a kind of hidden prophetic clock, a timeline that's literally counting down to a specific year. This passage gives us two key numbers, and these are basically the raw data for the whole timeline, 1,290 and 1,305 and 30. Now, according to the source, these are not just random numbers pulled out of a hat. They are precise prophetic periods of time. Okay, but how do you get a timeline out of that? Well, to make the math work, this interpretation uses a really key principle from prophetic analysis. It's this idea that in certain prophecies, one day actually represents 1 year. So those numbers we just saw, they're not talking about days, they're talking about years. So that first number, 1,290, that becomes a period of 1,290 years. Simple as that. And that second number, 1,335, well, that marks the final 1,335-year period that, you guessed it, according to this source, brings us right up to our time. So let's actually look at how they calculate this. The source lays out two different timelines. The first one is a 1290-year period, which they say runs from 605 BC to 685 AD. But the really critical one for this whole argument is the second timeline. They say it starts in 605 AD, it runs for 1335 years, and it lands exactly, precisely on the year 2020. All right, so how do all these pieces, the cosmic signs from Revelation, the pandemic from Luke, and this ancient clock from Daniel, how do they actually fit together? Well, the source weaves them all together to build one single focused argument that points to one specific year. So let's pull it all together one more time. You've got the big, broad cosmic signs from Revelation that are kind of setting the stage. Then you have the very specific event, COVID-19, which is identified from that passage in Luke. And finally, you have the mathematical timeline from Daniel that acts as a kind of anchor, ending, well, precisely in 2020. The core claim, then, is that these aren't just three separate, isolated passages that happen to sound similar. No, this interpretation sees them as pieces of one big interlocking prophecy, where symbols, real-world events, and this ancient clock were all designed from the beginning to converge on the year 2020. And that leaves us with a final thought. Regardless of what you personally believe about prophecy, this whole alignment raises a pretty fascinating question. What is it about these ancient texts that allows people to interpret them with such incredible specificity, right in the middle of our own modern world?
You know that total solar eclipse that crossed America? It was an incredible, once-in-a-generation event for millions of people. But for some, it wasn't just a cool thing to see in the sky.
not at all. There's an interpretation out there that says this celestial event was actually a super detailed prophecy, a warning written right across the sky. So today, we're going to unpack that.
So here's the big question, right? Was this just a beautiful, once-in-a-lifetime cosmic event, or was it something more? Well, this particular interpretation argues it's a profound prophetic sign, just packed with specific meanings and warnings. So let's break down exactly how they build this argument, piece by piece.
Okay, so the foundation of this entire prophecy, it all rests on two specific solar eclipses and the paths they carved across the United States. All right, so the first thing this source material does is connect two major celestial events: the Great American Eclipse of August 21st, 2017, and of course the more recent one from April 8th, 2024. Now that nearly 7-year gap between them, that's seen as the very first piece of the puzzle.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. When you actually map the paths of totality for both of these eclipses, they intersect. They form this giant, unmistakable X, or a cross, smack dab over the heartland of the United States. And according to this source, that is absolutely not an accident. So what is this cross? Well, it's interpreted as a modern-day sign of Jonah. And if you're not familiar, in the biblical story, the prophet Jonah was sent to the corrupt city of Nineveh with a pretty stark choice: repent or face total destruction. So you can see right from the get-go, this interpretation frames these eclipses as a massive warning sign for the entire nation.
All right, let's move on to the next layer and see how this interpretation decodes the exact timing between these two events. It claims the numbers themselves, well, they contain a hidden message.
Okay, so the source does this very specific calculation of the time between the two eclipses. It starts the clock with the full years, and that's 6.
Then it adds the remaining months, bringing the total to 6 months. From there, you count off the full weeks, and, you guessed it, another 6.
And finally, it tacks on the last 6 days. So when you put it all together, the source lands on this exact and pretty startling figure: 6 years, 6 months, 6 weeks, and 6 days.
Now, according to the source, this 6666 figure is no coincidence at all. It's presented as this deeply symbolic number, a message that's signaling the completion of a 6,000-year age of man or carnal age. Basically, it's marking the end of one big era of human history right before a final, divine phase begins.
Okay, so the argument then pivots from numerology to geography. It claims that the exact path of that 2024 eclipse was also, divinely orchestrated to carry a very specific set of messages.
And this is where it gets incredibly specific. The source points out that the 2024 path of totality passed directly over 7 different towns named Nineveh. And, as if to really underline the point, it also crossed over a town called Jonah in Texas.
So this isn't seen as some random geographical quirk. No, it's presented as a direct parallel to the Bible. The idea is, just as Jonah brought a message to ancient Nineveh, this eclipse is seen as bringing a similar warning, a message about the destruction of the wicked to modern-day America.
All right, now let's go back to the center of that celestial cross, the exact intersection point of the two eclipses. It falls over a region of southern Illinois that's been nicknamed Little Egypt. And you guessed it, the source argues this is also deeply symbolic, injecting the theme of a Passover. That biblical story that centers on divine judgment for some, but miraculous deliverance for others.
So now the interpretation really widens its focus, connecting these celestial signs to a grand historical timeline of world powers, and then tying them to specific modern leaders.
This framework, it presents a really unique view of history, where major world powers, we're talking Babylon, Persia, Rome, each served a specific prophetic purpose. And in this interpretation, the United States is the final world power in this chain, with a designated role to play in the end times. That, the source claims, is exactly why these powerful signs are appearing specifically over America.
Okay, so from there, the source makes a very specific connection to world leaders. It states that when Donald Trump was inaugurated back in 2017, just a few months before that first eclipse, his age was exactly 70 years, 7 months, and 7 days old.
And the source claims this numerical pattern doesn't even stop there. It asserts that on the exact day of Trump's election win, another world leader, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, hit the very same milestone in his time in office:
7 years, 7 months, and 7 days.
This parallel is presented as just another layer of what it calls divine coordination. Okay, so all of these signs, you've got the cross, the numbers, the path, the leaders, they're all said to be building toward a final apocalyptic prediction, and it's drawn directly from the biblical book of Revelation. The source points to this specific biblical passage as the key to understanding our current moment. It argues that today's global conflicts, well, that's the nation rising against nation part. And these two eclipses, they are the literal great signs from heaven that the text predicted would come right before the end. So, in this interpretation, all of these events mean humanity is now living through what the Bible calls the opening of the sixth seal. You can think of it like a specific chapter in the end times prophecy, a period defined by cosmic signs and earthly chaos, all serving as the final warning before the really catastrophic events are unleashed. The world will then enter the next phase, the sixth trumpet, which it describes as the release of 4 destructive angels, ultimately culminating in a global war that will kill 1/3 of all humanity.
Today, we're diving into some source material that lays out a pretty intense prophetic timeline for what it calls the final slaughter at Armageddon. So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll try to figure out who the key players are in this prophecy. Then, we'll get into the conflict itself and ask, where is this final battlefield? And finally, we'll look at the specific signs that are supposed to kick everything off. All right, first up. The source we're looking at zeroes in on these 2 central figures called the 2 witnesses. In biblical terms, these are prophetic voices that stand before the entire world. Okay, so who exactly are these 2 witnesses? According to this particular interpretation, we're not talking about ancient prophets. No, the source material claims they're actually modern-day superpowers. So who are they? Well, the source draws a pretty direct line here. The first witness, which it connects to the ancient Christian congregation in Thyatira, is said to be the European nations in NATO. And the second witness? That's linked to the Philadelphia congregation and is interpreted as the United States, specifically under the leadership of Donald Trump. And this idea is pulled straight from the book of Revelation, which talks about these witnesses as 2 candlesticks. The source then takes that ancient symbol and applies it to today, saying that Europe and the US are joined together as one single power through the NATO military alliance. So that brings us to NATO's role in all this, which, according to the source, is absolutely critical to the prophecy. Yeah, pulling from another passage in Revelation, the text argues that NATO is this prophesied one mind. A huge coalition that gives all its power and strength to a single, coordinated goal on the world stage. And the source actually has a name for this kind of superpower-driven global chaos, the Great Babel. It's a clear parallel to the whole Tower of Babel story, basically suggesting that what we're seeing today is a modern version of that same ancient grab for unified worldly power. So the thinking goes that NATO uses its military muscle to stir up chaos and keep weaker nations down. But here's the twist. This power isn't supposed to last. The prophecy, as interpreted here, says the alliance will eventually be defeated, killed, as the source puts it, by the very beast system it serves, all coming to a head in a third world war. Okay, so if a massive final war is on the horizon, the big question is, where? Where does the source say all this is going to go down? And the text is crystal clear on this one. The place of destruction for these 2 witnesses is called Armageddon, referencing that famous gathering in Revelation 16. And here's where it gets interesting. The source points to what it sees as a chilling historical pattern. It identifies Europe as this recurring place of destruction. Think about it. From the Holocaust in World War II all the way to the start of the war in Ukraine in 2022. The argument is that this history basically destines the continent to be the stage for the final battle. And while Armageddon is the battlefield for the 2 witnesses, the source points to a separate but connected prophecy specifically for Israel. The idea here is that Israel is prophesied to be destroyed in a different war, the Gog-Magog War, and its place of destruction is Megiddo. Now, Megiddo is historically and literally right next door to Armageddon, so they're deeply linked. All right, so how does this all get started? What really pulls you in is how the source lays out a series of very specific triggers that it claims will kick off this whole countdown to destruction. It's presented as a 3-step sequence of events in the near future. First, a direct war erupts between Israel and Iran. Second, Donald Trump gets reelected as the 47th US president. And third, that leads to an attack on Iran in 2026, which ends with the death of its leader. A pretty specific chain of events. And if that sequence plays out, we're brought right to the edge, the climax of the whole prophecy. We're talking about the final events tied to the sixth seal, the sixth vial, and the big one, the sounding of the sixth trumpet. Now, according to the source material, one of the biggest signs to watch for is the literal drying up of the Euphrates River. This isn't seen as just a metaphor, no. It's interpreted as a real physical event that clears a path for armies, identified as the kings of the East, to march. And while that's happening on the ground, something else is going on in the spiritual realm. The source says demonic spirits will be at work, gathering all the world's leaders and pushing them to come together for this final massive showdown. So, what this interpretation is really saying is that all the global alliances, the political moves we see in the news, they aren't just random. They're actually the prophecy unfolding in real time, pulling the world's leaders together and marching them, almost like they're being guided, straight towards Armageddon. This whole massive gathering of world powers all leads up to the moment the sixth trumpet sounds. And that sound is like the key in a lock. It's said to release 4 incredibly powerful angels who have been bound for ages at the Euphrates River, unleashing them with one single, absolutely devastating mission. And what is that mission? Well, according to Revelation 9:15, it is horrifyingly specific to slay 1/3 of all mankind. We're not just talking about a war at this point. This is a cataclysm on a scale that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. The source frames all of this as the final, terrible chapter in a long history of slaughter, a pattern that it claims is meant to stop God's people from reaching their destiny. It's a line drawn from the very first murder of Abel by Cain, through the slaughter of infants in ancient times, to the Holocaust, and now, finally, to this prophesied battle. So, what we have here is a detailed and, let's be honest, pretty alarming prophetic roadmap, and it really leaves you with a final thought to chew on. When you see ancient prophecies laid out so directly on top of modern-day headlines, how does that change the way you see the world and the events shaping it every day?
So what if ancient prophecies aren't just old stories? What if they're actually a kind of roadmap for what's happening in the world right now? Today, we're diving into a source that claims exactly that, arguing that we are on a direct path to a prophesied event known as Armageddon.
Okay, so the main claim from the source we're looking at is, well, it's pretty staggering. The idea is that global events today are lining up perfectly to signal the beginning of a final conflict, an event the prophecy calls the sixth trumpet.
This obviously begs a question, right? How exactly does an ancient text connect to our modern world, to today's headlines? So let's break down how the source makes its case, one step at a time. To really get what they're saying, we have to go right to the source text itself. We're talking about a prophecy from the book of Revelation that is the absolute foundation for this entire interpretation.
The prophecy kicks off with a very specific command, happening at a very specific place. Loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Now keep that location in mind. The Euphrates River is absolutely central to this whole narrative.
And what happens when these angels are released? Well, it's pretty grim. The text describes a massive, devastating slaughter that results in the death of 1/3 of all people, an event that the source directly equates with the Battle of Armageddon. And here's the thing, according to this interpretation, this isn't just a one-off event. It's actually part of a sequence, like prophetic dominoes falling. The moment the sixth trumpet sounds, it leads straight into the pouring of the sixth vial of wrath, which just escalates everything even further.
Okay, so if we're talking about a prophesied global conflict, who are the main players on the world stage? This is where the interpretation gets really fascinating, because the source starts drawing direct lines from ancient prophetic groups to modern nations and their alliances.
So let's break this down, because this is the who's who of the end times. According to this view, you've got these ancient groups from Revelation, like the Thyatira and Philadelphia congregations. This interpretation says they represent the historically Christian nations of Europe and the USA, which today make up the core of NATO. Israel and Judah are identified as the 2 witnesses, and then, maybe most importantly for this prophecy, the kings of the East are seen as a modern-day Russia-China alliance. You can see how this mapping is the absolute key to their whole geopolitical argument. But the big question is why? Why are these specific nations being pulled into a conflict? Well, according to the source, this is no accident of history or politics. It argues that there's a supernatural force at work, actively gathering these major players, NATO on one side, the Russia-China alliance on the other, for one last decisive battle, with NATO's actions being the main provocation.
All right, so how is this final battle actually supposed to go down? The source points to some really specific verses that it claims lay out the exact mechanics of how we get on this path to destruction.
And look, we're back at the Euphrates River again. This passage describes a major physical event. It's water drying up. And the interpretation here is pretty literal, that this is about clearing a physical path so that the armies of the kings of the East, that Russia-China alliance, can advance.
In this next part, this is supposed to reveal the real force at work here. The claim is that this isn't just about human politics. Instead, there are these unseen forces, called spirits of devils, that are influencing world leaders, the kings of the earth, and just irresistibly pulling them and their countries into this final prophesied war.
So you have all these events, all these players, and all these supernatural influences. And according to the prophecy, they are all heading to one single, specifically named location for the final showdown. And that's where it all comes to a head. The prophecy says he, referring to that supernatural force, gathers them all together. All the players are brought into one place, a place called, in the Hebrew tongue, Armageddon. This is it, the final destination that everything has been building towards.
Now, the source we're looking at makes a really big deal about the literal meaning of this word. It's not just a cool name for a battle. Armageddon literally translates to place of destruction.
So to try and figure out where this final place of destruction might be, the source looks back at history for a pattern. Think about it. Where did the biggest global conflicts of the 20th century happen? World War I and World War II. They were both centered primarily in one place, Europe.
And that is where the source material leaves us, with a really provocative question. If that historical pattern holds, and if its interpretation of a coming conflict between NATO and a Russia-China alliance is accurate, well, it asks us to consider, where will the 21st century's place of destruction be?
Okay, we're diving into a source with a really unique take on history and prophecy. Let's get into it.
And right off the bat, it asks a huge question, framing global conflict through a prophetic lens.
So, in this view, Armageddon isn't just a battle. It's a planned, nuclear self-destruction. So who's the target? According to this interpretation, it's NATO, specifically Europe and the USA.
To get this argument, you gotta know two key figures. First up is the sea beast.
And that's followed by the Earth Beast, which this text directly connects to the United States.
The claim is that these two powers, Papal Rome and the USA, are what came together to create NATO.
And in this view, NATO's job is simple: to intentionally provoke a final self-destructive world war.
Okay, but how do we get from ancient Rome to modern NATO? That's the crucial link, right?
Well, the argument is that unlike all those other empires, Rome, well, it never actually fell.
The text identifies Rome as a very specific figure from prophecy, the fourth beast from the book of Daniel. From this beast, a new power is said to have emerged through a specific series of historical events. This new power, identified as the papacy, is said to have reigned for a very specific length of time.
So what's the core belief driving this whole idea? Let's break it down.
Basically, that all superpowers are built to dominate, create chaos, and eventually destroy each other.
Which brings us right back to the present day, and this source's ultimate prediction for our time.
So, the Chronicle maps out a clear path of events, kicking off back in 2017.
All right, let's start at the very beginning of this whole timeline.
The text calls this year the early signs towards Armageddon. Pretty direct, right?
Okay, moving on to the next year. The text points to a big political move.
Specifically, it cites Donald Trump declaring Jerusalem the capital of Israel as the trigger.
Then there's a bit of a jump. The source says things really start heating up. NATO provokes war in Ukraine.
Now we're at 2024, and, well, the wording here gets interesting.
The Israel involved in direct conflicts with Israel. Yep, with itself.
And that brings us to the final event, the big climax of the whole prophecy.
The Chronicle's final prediction? A joint US-Israel attack on Iran.
So if you look at the whole thing, it lays out a clear path of escalation.
Which really makes you wonder, what do chronicles like this actually tell us about ourselves?
let's dive into a pretty mysterious prediction, and it's all about the year 2027. And what's wild is that this one sentence is our entire source. Super direct, right? It's a big claim. So to really get it, we've got to break it down piece by piece. First up, the source mentions a blood moon. So what exactly is that? It's basically a cool name for a total lunar eclipse. Earth gets right between the sun and moon. Okay, but it's not just about blood moons. The source also mentions a total solar eclipse. This is when the moon passes right in front of the sun, casting a huge shadow on Earth. So, you see, it's all about the lineup. For one, Earth's in the middle. For the other, the moon is. But the source says there's a pattern. So what does that actually mean? Well, it also uses the word seasons. That hints these aren't just random one-off events. It points to a repeating cycle, a series of both these eclipses happening again and again. So you've got this predictable celestial pattern. And the prediction is that this whole pattern is going to, well, conclude. And it gives a very specific end date, 2027. This timeline shows it perfectly, a repeating pattern that just stops. Okay, let's put all the pieces back together and see the full picture. So there's a pattern of eclipses, these seasons, and it's all supposed to end in 2027. So when we look at that original quote again, it makes perfect sense now. A known cycle is ending. But you know, if one thing ends, it leaves you wondering, what's supposed to begin? So what if the number 7 is actually a hidden key connecting major biblical events? Well, that's the idea behind the 7-year prophetic parallel. It's all about divine timing. Okay, our first clue goes way back to Noah, right before the Great Flood. The crucial part? A 7-year timeline leading right up to that massive event. That was the window Noah had to get the ark ready for what was coming. Now, jump forward a few thousand years, and guess what? That same 7-year pattern shows up again. This time, it's all about John the Baptist and Jesus, from 27 to 33 AD. Yep, this block of time is seen as the second big instance of this prophetic pattern. So you've got Noah's 7 years before destruction, and then Jesus' 7 years setting up something new. But here's the kicker. What if this pattern isn't over? What if it's pointing to the future? So you see this arc, right? It connects Noah, then Jesus, and then a prophesied future event. And that next step, it's believed to be the 7-year tribulation, a pretty intense prophesied period. Okay, to recap, the number 7 links Noah's ark, John and Jesus, and a future tribulation. Which leaves us with a huge question. If this pattern really holds, what does that mean for what's coming?
So what if the years 2027 to 2033 are a direct echo of events from the first century?
Here's how we're going to break it down. A prophetic parallel, the prophecy itself, and how it all connects.
The whole theory boils down to this: a chronological parallel between the past and our immediate future.
So where does this all come from? Well, it's rooted in a specific passage in the book of Daniel. Now, the interpretation really focuses on a few key phrases from this exact verse. Let's dig in.
First up, the phrase, Messiah be cut off. The theory says this points directly to the crucifixion.
Then we have the prince that shall come. This is interpreted as the Roman general Titus. And finally, the war and desolations. This is said to point toward a huge future conflict. Okay, but how do they get a specific date? Well, it all comes down to some prophetic math. The calculation starts with a decree in 444 BCE and uses prophetic language to land on 33 AD.
And this is the number that holds it all together, 173,880 days.
But see, this isn't just a one-time calculation. It's meant to establish a historical pattern.
They call this the first messianic cycle. It's a 7-year block, split right down the middle.
Right, so here's the big question. What does any of this have to do with us today?
The idea is that the first cycle is a direct template for a future cycle starting in 2027.
So let's recap. It all starts with Daniel 9, which leads to a number, creating an historical pattern.
Which leaves us with this final thought. What happens when ancient math seems to point directly to tomorrow?
A 7-year period from the past, mirroring one in our future. So you've got these two timelines. The theory says they're not just similar, they're a direct prophetic reflection. So how does this parallel actually work? Well, it splits each 7-year block into 2 perfect halves. First up, you've got the years 27 to 30 AD, drawing a direct line to our near future. And this first 3.5-year stretch, it's specifically linked to a figure called a prophetic John. Okay, so after that comes the second half, which mirrors the historical period from 30 to 33 AD. And the second block of time, that's connected to a figure they call a prophetic Jesus. So where does this all come from? The structure points to the 2 witnesses from the book of Revelation. And that prophecy is key. It's built on a 3.5 plus 3.5 structure, just like this timeline. Okay, so let's put it all together. This table lays out the entire proposed parallels side by side. The big takeaway here is this idea of a perfect pattern repeating itself exactly 2,000 years later. It really leaves you with a big question. Is history a straight line or a cycle waiting to be decoded? Okay, today we're diving into a really fascinating idea. What if history, written up in the stars, could actually repeat itself? We're looking at some material that suggests a series of, well, pretty uncanny celestial parallels that are separated by exactly 2,000 years. It's a story called Cosmic Echoes, 33 AD and 2033 AD. And that brings us to this central, really intriguing question. Do cosmic events leave an echo through time? I mean, it's a huge idea, right? But it's also the key to understanding the specific patterns that our source material claims to have uncovered. All right, so let's jump right into these so-called echoes in the cosmos. We're going to explore this pattern that's supposedly separated by 2 full millennia. The whole comparison here really hinges on these 2 specific points in time. First, you've got 32 to 33 AD, which is noted for some significant historical celestial events right around the time of the crucifixion. And then you have its echo, 2032 to 2033 AD, a time filled with predicted celestial parallels. The basic claim is that the sky in our near future is going to directly mirror the distant past. Now, the first major celestial sign that we really need to look at is something called the blood moon tetrad. This is presented as a key 4-part event that connects these 2 different eras. So, what exactly is a blood moon tetrad? Well, it's not just any old eclipse. It's a very specific and pretty rare sequence. We're talking about 4 total lunar eclipses, one after the other, with no partial ones messing up the streak. That rarity is part of what makes it so significant here. And here it is, the first huge parallel the source points to. It claims that back in 32-33 AD, a blood moon tetrad happened, and its 4 eclipses lined up perfectly with 2 major Jewish holidays, Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, let's fast forward 2,000 years. The predicted tetrad of 2023, yeah, it's supposedly set to align with the very same holidays. But hold on. The moon isn't the only player in this game. The source material now shifts our focus over to the sun, drawing a parallel it calls the shadow of the sun. So for this next parallel, the historical anchor is a major celestial event noted in the source, a total solar eclipse that is said to have happened in 33 AD, right at the time of the crucifixion. This event is presented as the first half of this new echo. And the source really emphasizes one crucial detail about the specific event. The darkness is said to have lasted for 3 hours. This isn't just a minor detail. It's presented as a really significant marker. So here's the parallel. You have the total solar eclipse that was claimed to have happened during the crucifixion in 33 AD, and that's being set against a predicted total solar eclipse in 2033, which is set to occur right over the North Pole. Another event, another 2,000-year echo. And believe it or not, there's one final layer to this pattern. The source adds a detail that it frames as a kind of notable conclusion, a century's final sign, if you will. Okay, so before we put a bow on this, let's circle back to that future blood moon tetrad. The source points out one last pretty crucial detail about it, a detail that kind of gives the whole sequence a sense of finality for our time. And here's the claim, pulled directly from the source. The blood moon tetrad of 2032-2033 is the last blood moon tetrad in the 21st century. You see what that does? It positions the event not just as an echo, but as the absolute final one of its kind for basically anyone alive today. Okay, so let's just do a quick recap of the parallels we've just laid out. We've got a blood moon tetrad falling on specific Jewish holidays, first in 3233 AD, and then again in 2032-2033. Then we have a total solar eclipse in 33 AD, mirrored by another one in 2033. All these cosmic events are connected across a precise 2,000-year gap. And to top it all off, that future tetrad is claimed to be the very last one of our century.
Which, of course, brings us all the way back to our central question. After laying out all of these parallels, the source basically leaves us to wonder, are these patterns just some grand cosmic coincidence? Or could they be something more? Maybe a deliberate echo across millennia?
Right at the start of the Church Age. Then it highlights the recent one in 2014-2015, and finally, the upcoming 2032-2033 tetrad as the end. And what's crucial is that it notes all of these tetrads happen to fall on the Jewish feasts of Passover and Tabernacles. Okay, this brings us to the grand finale. This is where all these different threads we've been following, Daniel's clock, the historical patterns, the celestial signs, are all woven together to converge on one single climactic point in time.
So the number 40 carries a lot of weight here. The source calculates that there are exactly 40 Jubilee cycles, and a Jubilee is a biblical cycle of 50 years that span the time from that pivotal year of 33 AD all the way up to our target year, 2033. So what this creates is what the source presents as a final countdown. It pinpoints 2024 as a Jubilee anniversary, then 2027 as the start of that final 7 years, and 2030 as another key marker, all of it leading directly to this moment of finality in 2033.
And this is it. This is the ultimate claim, the very summit of this whole intricate system of dates and parallels. The idea is that by the year 2033, every single remaining biblical prophecy will have found its fulfillment.
But, and this is a really, really important but, it is absolutely essential to point out this final detail from the source material itself. After laying out this incredibly detailed timeline, it includes this critical caveat, that while the signs and the seasons can be interpreted, the specific day itself remains unknown. So here's a thought. What if the biggest threat to a country isn't some outside enemy, but actually its own leaders? Today, we're going to break down this really powerful, timeless message about what power truly is and, the incredible weight of responsibility that comes with it.
This right here, this is what we're digging into. And let me tell you, this isn't some polite suggestion. It's more like a slap in the face. A real ultimatum for any leader. Doesn't matter if they were ancient kings or modern-day presidents.
And this line, this is the core of the whole thing. The central idea. Power is like a candle flame, right? It flickers, and eventually it's going to go out. But the responsibility, that's the shadow that flame casts. And that shadow, man, it stretches on and on across generations, way after that candle has burned out.
So, the text kicks things off by drawing a really clear line in the sand. It forces us to look at this fundamental clash between the temporary nature of power and the, permanent consequences of how you use it. And what's so interesting here is how it's presented. It's not like these two things are equal, not a balanced scale at all. The message is pretty clear. Power might feel like this huge, heavy thing when you have it, but that feeling is nothing, literally nothing, compared to the crushing weight of responsibility that follows. It really makes you wonder, right? How many leaders actually get that?
All right, so the big question is, how does a nation actually fall? You'd probably guess it's an enemy, right? An invasion, but nope. This text says the real problem, the real decay, starts from the inside out.
Yeah, and this next part, it's a real gut punch. It's basically saying empires don't get defeated. They take themselves out. It's this slow, internal poisoning of character, and it all starts right at the very top.
And look at this, it lays out the whole tragic process, like dominoes falling. First, pride gets bigger than common sense. Then, that hunger for more just steamrolls your conscience. After that, the only tool in the toolbox is raw strength, used without any thought. And the final step? The nation doesn't even know who it is anymore. Its entire identity is just about its rivals and its enemies.
And, a sickness like that, it never just stays home. It's bound to spread. It inevitably spills over the borders and leads to the worst-case scenario, war. And let me tell you, the text does not pull any punches when it talks about the real cost of war.
This quote is just haunting.
It's a powerful reminder that the real damage from a war isn't just the stuff you can count on a battlefield. It's the trauma, the hurt, that gets stitched into the very soul of a society. It becomes this dark heirloom that gets passed down again and again.
And here's another really crucial point, a warning really. It's this idea that you can have a controlled war. The text completely dismantles that myth. It paints war as a wildfire. You might light the match thinking you know exactly where the fire is going to go, but once it's out of control, it just burns. It goes everywhere, consumes everything, and goes way, way beyond what you ever planned.
Okay, so if going all in on military power and dominance just leads to ruin, what's the other option? Well, this is where the text gets really interesting. It doesn't just point out what's wrong, it actually gives us a totally different, almost backward way of thinking about what real strength is.
And boom, here it is. I mean, that just flies in the face of everything we're normally told about power, right? It's saying real strength isn't about how many weapons you've got. It's about having the wisdom and the self-control to keep them on the shelf.
So, you can see the choice it lays out for leaders. Is your strength measured by who you can defeat, or by the lives you can protect? One path leads to domination and destruction. The other leads to restraint and preservation. It's a choice between leaving behind a legacy of ruin or a legacy of life.
All right, this is it. We're getting to the heart of the message now. We've seen the problem, we've seen what causes it, and we've seen the alternative. So now the text lays it all on the line. It delivers its final ultimatum, and it's a choice that every single leader has had to face from the beginning of time right up to this very moment.
And it poses this incredibly urgent question, right at that tipping point. That moment when talk is about to turn into action, when competition is about to become a full-blown catastrophe. It's asking right here, right now, what choice do you make before there's no turning back?
The answer starts with, well, a little bit of humility. It's a simple truth. It's a reminder that no matter how big and powerful you are, it's not going to last forever. The biggest empires, the strongest dynasties, in the grand scheme of things, they're just blips on the radar.
And then there's the answer, the punchline, if you will. Empires and nations, they come and go. But humanity, our collective story, that's what has to last. And whether it does or not, well, that all comes down to one thing. Leaders choosing to value peace more than they value their own pride. That's it. That's the ultimate responsibility.
So, in the end, the message is incredibly clear. History isn't just whispering to us. It's screaming warnings from the wreckage of every empire that has ever fallen. The real test, then, isn't about whether we can hear that warning. It's about whether we're wise enough to actually listen. And that choice, well, that choice is always up to us.